I did, this is the Gospel of John. I just got to say at the beginning because I horrible at uploading these, and I do them in groups, and then I don't ever know what they are. Use most because I wear a black T-shirt every day, so it makes it difficult to identify. Well, this is the fourth Gospel, and probably one that you are the most familiar with, would be my guess. Not necessarily because we spend a lot of time or use it in our worship. I think Luke sort of dominates that realm, and I think we do have some balance there. But I think for many of us who have grown up in the last century, which is all of us, the Gospel of John sort of rose as this premier book. And for those of you who were at the book club yesterday, we talked about that sort of validation of things in literature that sort of competed with the academy, and just sort of to bring it to a conversation that was accepted. John has been used highly in the last century as sort of the main sort of apologetic book for the existence of God and Jesus, and not necessarily having the authority of the book doesn't come from itself. The authority of the book comes from the Spirit, but there's some bold claims about cosmology in the book. And cosmology, just as a word, generally means just the cosmos, the world around us, everything in the material world, everything that we interact with, our views of that. So when we talk about our cosmos, we live in a solar system, but we also believe in angelic beings and the spirit world, and a God that's outside of this world, and possibly a place where we go if we're bad, and eternity. So all of those things fit into our cosmos. John deals with the idea of the cosmos more than the other gospels, and we'll talk about some of the differences today. But let's jump into some of the basics, and then we'll go into some of the themes. I want to talk, the number 7 just keeps coming up through John, and John is a cultivated and curated book. There are 7 I am statements that Jesus claims. There are 7 signs that are offered. There are 7 titles that are, so the notion of the number 7 is a very strong number in John. There are tremendous influences from the culture at the time that John was being written, and in John's writing that sort of reflect the times that they were in. But let's dig into some of the basics, or some of the sort of structure of it, and look at the sort of background. The Gospel of John is more of a systematic theological account of the events of Jesus' life, as opposed to a narrative account or a historical account. And it does follow and has many similarities with the other 3 Gospels, but it differentiates itself so much that we refer to Matthew, Mark, and Luke as the synoptic Gospels because of their overlap and their similarity, and John really represents a lot of its own information. The authorship, believe it or not, is considered anonymous, and I think and which is interesting. Again, all of these, you see little bits and pieces of who the author might be. Irenaeus in 130, who was an early church father, died around 202. Was the first known sort of documented source to name this book as being John. Authorship is the fact that it's the disciple who Jesus loved. Whoa! That is the second time that's happened today. We have another hummingbird. Should we just let it be and make it find its way out? All right, if it buzzes my head, then. So what's interesting about that is the disciple of Jesus loved, and this goes back to this sort of friendship icon. This is the disciple that Jesus loved, and this friendship, and John portrays this unnamed disciple. The Gospel of John portrays an unnamed disciple as the disciple that Jesus loved. Now, that's considered intentional because the book is highly, curated and written in a certain, edited in a certain way. And because the other disciples are extensively named, I thought that that John was sort of intentionally left his name out. Now, the question becomes was it John the disciple who hung out with Jesus? Were you going to say something?
I was going there too.
Or they consider later to be John the Elder. One of the things that leads it to think that maybe it wasn't John the fisherman was that it has a fairly sophisticated language, the Greek language and the grammar is fairly sophisticated. And really the theology that is present in the book is much more developed than you would probably find for a fisherman who is probably, not quite educated. So John would have had to make some education. John the disciple would have had to make some educational advancements, probably that he was a fisherman at the time that this book came about. Which was around 90 to 100, although some dated as early as 70, around the time of the fall of the Second Temple or the destruction of the Second Temple. But the dating of it, really, for a number of reasons, but the one that I thought was really the most interesting is Thomas's expression, "My Lord, my God," is a phrase that they would have during that time period used for a Roman emperor. So in other words, that the language of that would have been cultivated into the part of it would have been an expression that was used at the time. So roughly the same time, kind of as Luke and Matthew were being constructed, were similar, sort of 80 to 100. So they're kind of contemporaries, again, putting Mark early in the 60s. But its audience is thought definitively to be both Jewish and Gentile, and the rationale for that is because there's extra explanation for Jewish concepts that if you were only writing to a Jewish audience, you probably wouldn't include, because the assumption would have been there that it was there. And the context of it was sort of late first century, sort of that 90s to 110. The interesting thing about it, and I actually sort of followed this rabbit trail a little bit, this notion of a Johannine community. And really this is where the authorship conversation sort of comes to the full head. When the writing of this John is considered to be a part of a corpus of literature called the Johannine literature, which includes John, the Gospel of John 1, 2, and 3, and Revelation. And they have similar grammar, they have similar theological concepts. Same author, they're actually considered to be, all of them were books or that could have come from the Johannine community that were taking things that an elder John or even the disciple John were teaching, but to the extent that there's connection between those, whichever Revelation is probably the farthest stretch, but it is all sort of paints a larger picture. So the thought is that basically Johannine community really refers to sort of an early Jewish community, and they would have either considered themselves sort of a new form of Judaism, but the Jews would have considered themselves sectarians. And they might have, and they differ. In other words, proper Jewish would have looked at them as sort of breaking off. They're like a branch or a sect, an apostate one that was acknowledging this prophet as a Messiah, or this, but also different from. So, in other words, not everyone formed was a combination of Jewish and Gentile Christians. Those very first communities that were formed, we often forget, were purely Jewish. But over time, as Gentiles came in, that Jewish community became smaller and smaller, just as the conversion rate, so to speak, went up. Any questions about that? Thoughts? The time that it came in is important. The time that it was written is important. In particular, we're going to talk about a little bit about the notion of Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is something that really sort of came into full bloom in the mid-second century, 150s to 200. But John represents a strong Gnostic or Greek influence, way more than the other three. And this is where we think some of the deeper theology and philosophy come. At the time, if John was writing in being influenced by this Hellenization, as we call it, but as this was happening, John's allowing these concepts of the cosmology of the world, and it's very strong, in particular in the first chapter of the Incarnation and this idea of this other world with the cosmos. And not to mention, we'll talk about a few of those things in that, about even a Jewish view of God that sort of was brought into the conversation. A few of the features that make John unique: there are longer speeches and fewer parables. There are, in fact, no narrative parables, and that is a major departure from the other Gospels, because it wasn't, the parables were meant to teach early Christians. So this is thought to be a little bit more of a book for I don't want to say an advanced audience, sense, a shift in the education or literacy of people in that region at the time. It is unique in that none of the other Gospels use the I am statements, and we'll go through those. I guess they're worth going through. Maybe we'll just, let's go through those at the end of the other features, since there's kind of the Incarnation, and this is sort of viewed as the Incarnation is the fullest revelation of God. Now, and when you think about this in terms of the Jewish context, the issue is always God's presence. You know, was God there? Was God in the temple? Was God in the ark? Was God in the tabernacle? Where was God? God's presence left. There was 400 years of silence. Now Jesus is the fullest revelation of God, and not only is it's just sort of an ideologically full, but it is God becoming human and experiencing our humanity. So this is like, you know, sort of a window into the true reality of who God is. There is a number of the other Gospels use language around scribes and Pharisees, and language that would have been representative of the day, and Sadducees, representative of the day that Jesus was in. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are trying to capture the narrative of Jesus in his context, even though they were writing this, you know, decades later. Whereas John only uses the language of Jews. And this makes it difficult, and scholars have debated over whether or not that is a reflection of his portrayal of Jews in the time of the writing, in addition to the time of Jesus. But as you look at it, you won't see references to Pharisees or Sadducees or scribes, because it's just in the New Christians. Read my own writing. What does it say? Gee, confrontation. Yeah, go for it.
Were the Pharisees,
Oh,
were the Pharisees influenced by Greek thought?
They would have highly resisted it. Not that they couldn't have been influenced by just by a cultural sense, but it would have been highly resistant. I mean, it was, in fact, Greek thought, which was spread throughout in various, you know, and even the tribes and other nations had a more maybe not a Greek, full-blown Greek system of polytheism, but enough that the idea of Judaism in the one true God was something that was like, that there's only one God was not something that almost any culture believed in. That's what they call radical monotheism, because at the time it would have been like the fact that there aren't other gods.
But the Pharisees were so big on the law and following codes. Weren't the Greeks also kind of emphasizing that?
No, the Greeks actually had a lot more liberty in their expression of life. They had different reason. Reason is what, in the same way, wisdom defined Jewish culture, reason defined Greek culture. So even long before Christ, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the succession of these great philosophers, so much of that was centered around the reason of humanity. And at the time that those were coming up, they would have been aware of Judaism and its monotheism. So, I mean, like there was an awareness probably of some, not that they knew the intricacies of Judaism, but the idea of rationality and temperate nature of the soul and taming the body. There are lots of similarities in religion because it's about discipline and self-control, etc. But it would have come through a different source. It would have been sort of the embodiment of the divine on earth through the human agent in Greek philosophy, as opposed to a fallen humanity that God is continually wrestling. So the narrative is different. Okay, so what I wrote was confrontation of the gospel, and then I couldn't figure out what it points to a decision. I thought I said deism. I was like, I don't know what that even means. John puts the reader in a place where there are several points throughout the scriptures where they have to make a decision. And if you read John as sort of a testimony or an evangelical proclamation of the good news, it brings you to places, and even at the extent at the end of it, which is a notable feature of it, and we just sort of incorporate that in now. If you turn to the end of it, it says, almost as a conclusion, right at the end, verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. In other words, nodding his head towards the fact, or them nodding their heads towards the fact that there were other narrative accounts, which are not written in this book, recognizing that that just was an intentional decision to exclude those stories and narratives. But these are written so that you, and that's first person dialogue, that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through believing, you may have life in his name. And that is sort of this, like, if you're reading this, even aloud or reading it in print, you get, if 21 wasn't there, 21 is questionable whether that was added at a certain time, but let's just say that that's where it ended. Well, you're left with, like, I just read 20 chapters of this, now I have a decision. And so the confrontation of the gospel is far more present than in perhaps in other gospels. And the final feature, I guess, and this will relate, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes when we talk about Gnosticism, is John's gospel is highly individualistic. In other words, Matthew, Mark, and Luke deal with the idea of a conversion into a community and the communal nature. And John, because it deals with philosophy and spiritual, sort of a mystical spirituality, something is happening, like a transformation, new life, and belief, that sense of relationship is an individualistic reconciliation with God, not necessarily, that is ultimately basically the witness, or the cloud of witnesses and the saints that are made up of people who have individually reconciled to God as opposed to reconciled in community. And this is a massive shift, and this is that Greek influence, because Greeks would hold themselves as individually responsible for their own virtues. And not that they wouldn't ascribe a community that forms that, but ultimately there was an individual agency that the Hebrews didn't have, because prior to Christ, they were being judged as a people. And their children bore the sins and the weight and the culpability of their parents. It's that sour grapes, cutting your teeth on sour grapes sort of parable or proverb, that those sins were passed on. And so there was that. And so this is a highly individualistic book that sort of confronts the individual with the idea of a personal relationship with God. Now, let's pause there. And I think that's fascinating, because John has been the dominating gospel in the Western world in the last century.
Because of our individualism.
Well, because of it, maybe, or contributing to it. But again, the Greek ideal sort of influencing, but I thought that, as I was reading about that, I thought, I never really thought about the individualistic nature of it, but a highly individualistic nature. And that really is, that's from Greek Gnosticism, and we'll put a pin in that and come back to that.
Would that be our evangelical influence too?
It would be too, because well, let's just do the Gnostic thing now. It's fine. What time are we at? We're good. That's 6:50. Huh?
12 to 6
12 to 6. What time do we end?
or 5:48.
What time is it? It's 5:48. We ended what time?
6:30.
6:30. Okay, I'll say what's doing the teaching yesterday that ends on the hour. Sort of confused. So Gnosticism is something that originated, really, Gnosticism refers to some Greek influences, but Christian Gnosticism became a thing. Like this was a valid expression of Christianity in the first century. So the first thing you need to understand is that although we reflect back on it and critique it at the time, this was like a common expression because they were dealing with these Greek influences and these cultural influences. So Gnosticism, as we sort of conceptualize it, actually originated in early Christianity, and it had an emphasis on the spiritual knowledge, or the gnosis, of over and against tradition and the teachings of the church and the authority of the church. So you see in this turn of the 1st and 2nd century, you see this Gnostic spirituality in a time that you don't really have a New Testament church with strong, like they didn't have a Bible they were relying on. So they didn't have written documents in the same way Judaism would have had the scrolls that they would have liked. They might have had fragments or teachings or letters or things that surfaced, but there wasn't an emphasis on those as being divine, having authority. So that they were left with tradition and the authority of this budding church, but it was sort of a loose authority, and the authority was really largely stemmed back to the apostolic succession, which is why so many books you'll see in the New Testament try to claim this sort of authority that is derived from those who hung out with Jesus. That's the closest thing. That's the reason we have the books that we have in the Bible is the apostolic succession. Can you trace a book back to eyewitness accounts of Jesus? Another reason John as a book is probably throughout the first few centuries of the church was linked to John the Apostle, not necessarily John the Elder that we see later in the Bible. And whether John, the 3 epistles of John were written by someone else. Gnosticism as a concept emphasizes that, and we've talked about this before, that our earthly existence is bad and evil. And so comes sort of this, you escape the material world by having full knowledge of the divine. And they're actually in Greek mythology, and you do see this actually, that there is almost like this supreme existence God that's always there. And that Yahweh and the expressions of Jesus and the church, they are actually sort of, they were created by the divine being in a way that they then ruled the material world. And the rule of the material world is complete, but our freedom from this world means going past the gods of the material world to the supreme God. Now, this is underscores the very idea of pluralism. The idea that above all of these expressions of faith, if we can push past enlightenment, was a huge piece of Gnosticism. And the small e enlightenment. And then in this way, Jesus comes to the world not as a savior, but as one who enlightens. Jesus pointed the way to the divine, the ultimate divine being, as opposed to Jesus has this sac. And so you see this influence in John of Jesus being this sort of cosmic savior. Still a savior figure, mind you, not that but that if you have knowledge of Jesus, it leads you to another realm beyond. And again, John deals with this sort of cosmology up here way more than the other disciples. They're interested, or the Gospels, they're interested in dealing with what's on the ground with reference to the divine being, but not necessarily describing the world that John is sort of cultivated this picture in. Okay, that's enough about Gnosticism. Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Isn't Jesus saying, I am a messenger of God? So isn't he just informing people of God and God's kingdom, and that he's been sent here to?
That's what Gnostics would want to claim.
Okay.
But in reality, and this is where John is, and this is the debate about whether Gnosticism had already started rooting itself in the culture at the time, and because of a lot of things that he writes, although it reflects some understanding of the cosmology of Gnosticism, it actually addresses some of the ideals that who Jesus was, not just in enlightenment, but I mean, in the I am statements, which we never came back to. I am the bread of life, the light of the world, the gate, the way, the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life, the true vine. These were claims that Jesus made that differentiated himself just as an enlightened one and pointed to himself as being the only way. So it would have been in conflict with Gnosticism, because Jesus then was meant to be a real part of this material world, which Gnostics would have said the divine can't be part of the broken, fallen world. So they would have sort of refuted Jesus's humanity and said he just appeared in the appearance or the form of humanity, but we weren't able, or we were too thick to really understand and
But then
perceive
he
that.
thought it when he said Thomas touched him.
Yes, and that was
He sort of was fighting Gnosticism.
he was, well, in particular, in his resurrected form, and that again paints a picture of like what our resurrected bodies could be like. And I don't think necessarily, people often say when you die, like if that's the case, I want to die when I'm like 25 at my peak. If you got to spend eternity in a body, you want to go out and you're in the peak condition. I was working out 2 hours a day when I was 25. I was benching 250 easy. If I'm going to die, that's the time to go like that. I don't want to do it, when I'm, So I don't know how the other bodily works, but
I mean, what I was saying is he was saying that he was a human being.
Yes.
Where Gnostics, some of them, body was just a spirit.
Yeah.
And a lot of our cults nowadays kind of stem.
But the Gnostic ideal of this dualism or, multi-tiered layer of the world actually is a part of our understanding of heaven and hell and this earth. Also, not surprisingly, was bolstered in the last century. Why? Because we focused on John. So it's interesting to think how our current understanding of theology is much more representative of the other gospels. And I don't think until I was preparing for today that I was like, wow, this is, in particular after yesterday's discussion, I was like, there's so many similarities and connections.
Dante certainly was into that, wasn't he?
Well, yeah,
that's not our century.
Well, and that's it.
A long way, but that,
And Dante, I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe Dante is John is the source of that, amongst other. John has been used as in literature and history and music. References to John and John's cosmology have dominated the expressions in popular culture, if you will, throughout history. But in particular in the last century. Okay, so let's do the I am statements, and I never came back to those. And then we'll go to the structure, and then I'll do some comparisons between the two. 7 times he makes statements of self-revelation. He begins them with I am, and I'll give you those references. I'm going to give you the first reference. There's actually multiple references to each of them, most of them. But I do think it's worthwhile, first of all, saying that the concept of I am is a statement that would have directly connected. It's a declaration. And when Moses was confronted in the bush, was confronted with the burning bush, and God, Yahweh, Jehovah said, I am that I am. God was making a statement of existence. I am that I am. This wasn't Popeye. This was like, I am all that there is. I am the life, the being, the energy, the power, all of this, everything in existence. God was claiming true existence over and again. Statements with "I am." This is a sort of self-revelation in the sense of not revealing himself, but to himself, but revealing who he is to the world. So this is the supreme claim. These are the supreme claims that Jesus makes. He says, I'm the Son of Man, and none of the things that he uses terms. We'll go over some of the titles that Jesus used. But these 7 statements, so 6:35, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And this bread of life thing is, and I love this theme. And so I have a lot of book projects that I would love to work on. One of them has always been, I would love to do a combo cookbook exposition of bread in Scripture. It's fascinating. Why? Because the very first mention of bread is from God's own voice. I give you the fruit to eat. After the fall, it says, I give you the plants of the field. Bread will be, you will eat from the plants of the field by the sweat of your brow to your death. Or I think it's bread the bread of death. But you eat bread until you die. Bread is a representation of the grains of the earth that need to be cultivated. So the bread is a symbol of our curse. As human, that's it. So then you have all of a sudden bread becomes the only thing, and you have the unleavened bread, and you have bread throughout there's a number of places the bread comes in, but you jump forward, bread is the unleavened bread that had to be taken with them out of Egypt. They have no food. God provides this manna. Now bread is this substance that they're like surviving on this dew and this dough that they can make from this dew, sort of residue. And you have this sort of reliance on bread all throughout the Old Testament. It's part of the rituals, it's part of the traditions. They use it in their festivals. But everyone knows from this curse narrative that bread leads, the bread of death, or the bread that we eat leads to death. You're stuck in this condition. So when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, this is in direct sort of opposition to the curse narrative where God said, bread will be yours for food. And that bread will lead to death. This bread will lead to life. So that was his first statement. He says in 8:12 that he is the light of the world. And this has references that go back to the creation account of the light and the darkness. And so Jesus is claiming his preeminence. And if you look at the beginning of John, this is 8 chapters in. When we'll go back to that incarnation account, but that when Jesus, it's like before the foundation of the world, the idea that Jesus was there before. So Jesus then becomes the light. And so every reference in John to the light or the lightness is sort of this goodness or purity or a divine nature that comes through. So Jesus claims that for himself. In 10:7, I think that's what I wrote. He said there was a sheep coming home, and the sheep would have, we consider the sort of saved, the elect or the stuff. He's saying he is, and then he says in 3 verses later in 10:11 that he's the good shepherd. I remember actually facing this dilemma: is so what are you the gate or are you the good shepherd? Choose one. You can't be both the gate and the good shepherd. But obviously you can. So that there's sort of a mixed metaphor. He's the way through, but he's also the good shepherd leading us through. And so there's that image of the good shepherd. Lamb. He's everything. Jesus is everything. Jesus is the answer in Sunday school. If you don't know the answer, you just say Jesus. Jesus. Just say Jesus. And if you don't know, where someone's from, I'd like to say, just sing this Texas. Safe bet. Where are you from, Texas? Jesus says in 11:25 through 26 and 25 and 20, he calls himself the resurrection and the life. And what's interesting about this is, if you want to go to that 11:25, I think this is an interesting one too. 11:25. You have the death of Lazarus, and then Jesus is raising, and then Jesus says, and was it 20, 21, Jesus says to her, when Jesus was talking to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? There's that confrontation of the gospel, like, hey, do you believe this? And that is meant to be a rhetorical device that not just for the narrative in, but it's also meant to be a rhetorical device that almost is posing the question to the reader. She said, yes, Lord, I believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. And so there's this notion, and that plays back into the idea of the incarnation. But right after this, in the same chapter, it says Jesus weeps and goes on. But then it says Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. So not only is Jesus claiming to be the resurrection, this escape from the material world, and this is that Gnostic influence, but he is claiming to be, and he also demonstrates in the same chapter, in the same narrative, not only that he is the resurrection, but that he has the power to resurrect. And this is a major, we'll see in the structure part, but this becomes a major point in terms of the shift of the narrative. After this resurrection of Lazarus, things start to sort of crumble for Jesus and his popularity with the masses, and it leads to his death. And not only is the resurrection, he claims it as life, the life, this notion of, and really the notion of eternal life, or this forever, this kind of infinite, that's something that's very strongly Greek too as well. 14:6, probably one of the ones that we use the most. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The definitive article is being used. Some would say, in a more pluralistic sense, that the way, the truth, and the life doesn't necessarily mean the only. But we as Christians, actually, this is one of the unique features about Christianity, and really Judeo or Abrahamic faiths all sort of claim this universality. Although I think in Islam, there's actually a little bit more wiggle room than there is sometimes in Christianity. But the claim is that the way, and this is, when I first took a job in the UK, and I guess I was 24 back then, so back in like 96 or something, 97, but it was called the Way In Christian Fellowship, and I was like, it sounds like a cult, so we eventually changed the name of the church. But as I studied later in life, I realized that the way was actually a phrase that was very much used in the early church. So because it was considered there are paths to God, and if you have this whole movement of Judaism, the way is kind of like, this is a new Judaism, or this is the new covenant being branched off, and this is the way. And the claim to be the truth is more of a claim towards Gnosticism or Greek culture or Hellenization than it is towards Hebrew thought. That idea of truth, the knowledge that there's some pure essence of something beyond this world, is a very Greek ideal. So that plays into that well. And then the life just factors into everything else. I mean, like just the life and death narrative, that was a contradiction. And then in 15:1, he says, I am the true vine, and that source of life, the true vine that feeds all. There's the abide in me, which I am the vine, and you are the branches sort of thing. And the idea that we are connected to this divine source was a major proclamation at the time. Before I go to this, well, let's go to the structure. Well, now let's go to the themes, because we'll look at this in more detail in the structure. The themes really that we have in this are, again, with the Gnostic stuff, and we see that in the preeminence and the incarnation. And we're going to look at the first chapter a little bit more closely, because I think in the first grouping, it's pretty significant what they do. There is some scholars in the 19th century started noting that there was there was notable subordination between Jesus and God. This leads to some of the heresies in the early church. I mean, like, if you just read some of the Gospels at face value, I totally get why they would have maybe Jesus was adopted by God, or he was a subordinate God, or a lesser God, because the language even sitting at the right hand of the Father feels kind of subordinate. So this language comes through a little bit more strong in John, but there's an insistence on the divine nature of God. In this first chapter, this prologue, 1-18, really emphasizes that. We're going to look at that in a second. Another theme that comes through that I think is pretty strong, idea that Jesus is the Word, or we say the Logos, and the Logos a comparable word in logos for Greek philosophy would have been reason, this sort of cosmic reason, the divine order. Greeks are obsessed with having order about everything, and so the word would have been the ordering of the universe. So when John claims that the world was created through the word, what the Greeks would have heard that as, the logos, is the word was created through divine rationality. So when we talk about the Imago Dei, when we interpret the Imago Dei, we say this is our human rationality, our ability to think, these sort of things. These are actually Greek concepts, because the Jewish faith was not concerned with the ascent of knowledge, but the virtue of the heart and the love and obedience of God and the fear of God, whereas Greeks were obsessed with knowledge. And the last theme that I kind of want to just highlight is, and we'll see this, is that the cross is a symbol of God's glorification, not of humiliation. In fact, the other gospels tend to lean on the side of the cross being sort of the ultimate demise of Jesus, although there was this cosmic reversal in that. John looks at it as being the cross was the glorification. And so our strong emphasis of the cross has always been there, but that sense of the cross becomes so much more important for us in modern day times, even though the cross has become a symbol that is largely disconnected.
Could you just tell me what his glorification means?
Oftentimes people say that, so Jesus went through a rise in popularity, and then he was exalted when he came into Jerusalem. And then and most theology would say his exaltation preceded his humiliation, being the passion, the abuse, the crucifixion. And the humiliation, the crucifixion is a part of that. He ascended into hell, and when he came back, his resurrection was the glorification. Well, John centers that glorification on the cross, not on the tomb.
Because he says it is finished on the cross?
No, I just think it means, I think it's more like this is the cosmic, the cross was the divine, was the place of where the work was like ultimately paid for. Right? It's the divine reversal. Paul talks about the cross being foolishness. And the cross was something that you don't understand unless you do, because God was sacrificed.
Well, in the Gospels, he's always talking about when he's going to be glorified. It seems to me like it runs. He's always talking about when he's going to have his glorification.
Resurrection.
Well, and that's where and I think, where God was, God glorified Jesus, was it in the cross, was it in the resurrection, was it the ascension? I think the ultimate glorification will be in the second coming when the body is reunited. But this sense of glorification, and I thought this was very interesting. From the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have three places in the text of passion predictions. Like after the transfiguration, Jesus pulls him aside and says, "I'm going to be crucified," and this is a prediction. Whereas those aren't present in John, but there are three instances where Jesus is exalted, or talks about being. He said, "I'll be lifted up," and so that phrase "lifted up" is meant, and one commentator compared it to sort of a double entendre, lifted up in terms of the cross being lifted up, but also lifted up in the sense of glorification. Because for not that the resurrection was like that was just a natural result, but the death had to occur. But for John, the birth and the death are the full cycle of humanity. When you get into the resurrection, we're not talking about human elements, we're talking about divine elements. So reconciling the earthly existence comes through birth and death. And resurrection is something that we will experience, and he claims for Jesus, but we won't experience that till the end. All right, let's go through the structure. Oh, one last feature. There is a number of and I won't go into all of them, but there are a number of conflicts, and John uses feasts. In fact, he uses the four main sort of celebratory festival or feast times. One would be Sabbath. Sabbath is always a feast day. Two is there's a strong mention of Passover, and three, the festival or the Feast of the Tabernacle, and then fourth would be Jesus deals with Hanukkah. So they deal with the main four Jewish festival time. Purim would be really the main four, because Sabbath was considered a daily one. But three of the four main festivals were represented in John as being places where Jesus was identified further. In the Hanukkah, and the fourth one, Jesus says, "I'm the temple," and the feast of the tabernacle, he claims to be the light of the world. So there's these feasts that Jesus pops in on and makes these declarations of who he was or is. The structure is largely considered and agreed upon to be fourfold, and they actually, interestingly enough, I don't know if they even remember hearing this in seminaries, so maybe it was just something they said and glossed over. But we're gonna, but 1 through 18 is considered the prologue. It's also considered or called the hymn to the word. And because of the word being the Logos, Jesus, and it has, and we'll come back to that, it has a lot of connections to Genesis 1. 2 is the second section is 1:19, 12:50, or to the end of 12, the end of chapter 12. And that's actually referred to as the book of signs. And it basically categorizes Jesus's ministries in a various sort of ways, and it goes through, and we'll look at a couple of those briefly, because there's a couple. There are 7 signs that are represented in there that Jesus did that have major teachings that follow them, and ultimately that section ends after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and that begins his sort of persecution, or his immense persecution, because that's when I think that, for John, the Pharisees or the Sadducees, or the Jews, as he would call them, realized that, if he can raise people from the dead, we're dealing with something entirely different. Like, it's one thing, the sorcery and one thing, and magic and one, those are the things that happened, but to raise someone from the dead is a power over life and death that they just couldn't comprehend. The third section is called the Book of Glory, and it's 13 through 20, basically, and it ends with the verse that we looked at in saying the purpose of the book. And really this, and that goes along with the glorification theme that we looked at in terms of John emphasizing Jesus' glorification, but it's the process of what happened in the Last Supper, and beginning, the end of Lazarus when he transitions to Jerusalem, and all the way up to his death and resurrection. And then you have 21, which is kind of considered an epilogue. And it's kind of, Jesus appears to the 7 after the disciples. This might have been added on a point to deal more with that Gnostic notion of there was a physical return or appearance. Jesus and Peter, and then Jesus, and it ends, not surprisingly, and the Johannine community might have added this themselves, but Jesus and the beloved disciple, who, and it says right there at the very end in 21:24, this is, or maybe we go back up a couple verses. When Peter saw him, he said, to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Who's this him? Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what it is about you, follow me." So the rumor spread through the community that this disciple would not die. Now, who's this disciple? We don't know. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but that my will that he remains, I will come. And what is that to you? Then verse 24, this is the disciple who is testifying. So it's a claim for authorship to these things and has written them down. And we know that his testimony, and again, this is third person. So they're saying, him over there, we know that this testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. I think this sort of reiterates what we see at the end of, and it's kind of like re-emphasized. The end of the original was this way, and there's sort of a re-emphasis of this ending in a similar fashion. That everything one of them were written down. I suppose if the world itself could not contain the books would have been written, which is just sort of almost a little bit out of character, but at the same time, it sort of has a similarity to what we find in 2030. And then that it really sort of ends it. The book sort of caps off. It's kind of like the afterthought. You saw that in Mark, the extra endings, people are just sort of adding stuff. It happens. I will note that and before we get into, I want to take a moment to just look. Okay, to look at the. I would say in that one night in that first chapter in that prologue, right as they begin the books of the signs, there's this identification of who Jesus is. In other words, they want to solidify the identity of Jesus before he goes out and starts doing miracles and healing. And in that first chapter, from 19, from the prologue to the end of the chapter, you have Jesus is claimed to be the Lamb of God, the Son of God. He's called Rabbi. He calls himself the Son of Man, the Messiah. He's claimed to be Jesus of Nazareth, and he is called the King of Israel. So in other words, John is writing. He writes this sort of backstory of Jesus, and then the minute he goes into the book of signs, before we understand where Jesus was doing all these miracles, he wants to concretely identify who he is. So these phrases that come and surface in, some of the language does connect to the other gospels as well, but it's sort of, he's not trying to, the other disciples sort of build a little. He's not trying to build. He goes straight for, this is like the end all and be all of existence. And now he's on the earth and he's finding these things for himself.
20 says, I'm not the Messiah.
And 20 what? 120?
20.
Well, he's
John the Baptist.
John 20, where is it? Testimony of John.
John the Baptist.
Said he is not the Messiah. John's not the Messiah, just for confusion. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the things in this. We'll go over these in more detail, but I think they are features of John. So things that are in the synoptics gospels that are not in John, and they're pretty significant. The phrase "the kingdom of God" is not used. We saw that in Luke being a massive feast, so that was not a big piece. End of times discourse is not a huge piece, which is very interesting. I think the Johnny community saved that for Revelation. In other words, they had another place to put it. So this sort of, and really end times conversation is really something that is a doctrine for almost for the believers. What will happen at the end is not something you want to try to persuade people with, despite efforts in the last couple decades with all of the, what are they, those left behind years?
Right.
It doesn't contain the Sermon on the Mount, and it has less of an emphasis because of maybe some of that towards marginalized or like the mission of Jesus in terms of his earthly, like that's not strongly addressed. It has no Lord's Prayer. It doesn't actually name the baptism of Jesus, where usually is both an identification of John and Jesus was, and also John's identification of who Jesus was. And so that's actually one of those things that has sort of stumped people. Why wouldn't John use that as this divine representation? Likewise, there's no transfiguration. Also a place that we see identifies who Jesus is. So the question becomes, why did John choose to leave that out? And there are a number of theories around that. The institution of the Lord's Supper, we do have the gathering in the upper room as part of the narrative, but the language of I am the body, although there are other places where Jesus says, you'll eat of me, and it turns people away. The actual Lord's Supper does not.
Did we lose him for good or what?
I don't know.
Maybe not. I don't get as much out of this doing it this way. But maybe in real life, when you're actually there. When we were there last summer and stuff, it seemed like it. But I think I lose too much of it or something. Did we lose him? Are you there, Karen? I think we must have lost him.
Yep,
Do you have a hard time getting it when we're doing it this way?
yes,
Me too.
it's totally extraneous to us, it's interesting, but we're not really studying what the book is all about. We're studying what the influences of the writer is, and that might help us understand it. But we're not delving into what the meaning of the book is at all. But,
Yeah.
whoops, here we go.
We coming back?
Maybe.
Did we lose? Did we actually lose? I don't know if we've lost connection because I can still see you. So maybe
Yeah.
he just,
His name is on there now. Without the visual. What I try to do is read the book beforehand, and that helps. just because-
There, sorry about that.
there
Okay.
you go. We still don't have you, John, or, yeah, Jason.
I mean, Paul is.
Well,
Is it just the internet or what's happening here?
there is debate whether like that was sort of Peter's personality, or whether Luke was. Can you hear?
No, no.
You
We
there,
just heard you
Danny?
say that, but we're not getting
It's
it.
recording. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear what you
No?
just said,
Can you
but
hear me?
we lost everything you were saying prior to that.
Video. I don't know if they can hear me. So, oh, well, it's being recorded, so you have to listen to it later. I'm not saying.
Yeah,
I was just going over some of the differences of John and repeat myself for everyone. Well, I will cover the same things next week when we do sort of a parallel comparison of where you'll see that in a more fuller sense, in other words. So when you look at John, you can see how John has shaped our current expression of Christianity. You can see how this sort of purity of God and above there, it really differs from the God of the Old Testament in some sense. Like it's hard to reference. If you put a narrative characteristic with these two gods, it's almost like you're talking about two different gods. So the question is did the Jews not have it right and short-sighted? Was it just that God hadn't revealed everything to them? And in the New Testament, we start to see a broader cosmology, which would imply that to correct or steer Jewish thought that eventually emerged into Christian thought. I mean, like even the doctrine of the Trinity was not something that was a part of the church really it was sort of loosely sort of a doctrinal statement until the 4th century. And I did read somewhere, I don't remember the exact reference, but apparently the Egyptians also have a threefold God. So it just shows you, and again, honestly, we can nitpick this stuff, but in the end of the day, like, none of us have perfect knowledge of who God is. We have full revelation in our lives that God is real, and that's what causes us to have faith. But any gospel taken in isolation portrays sort of a little different view of who God is. But when you take into cultural considerations what they're writing to, some of the outside influences, more Greek influence in John, maybe writing to a Greek audience, Matt. So those things just have to be taken into consideration. And balance. And that's John.
But the God of the New Testament could just be a whole different side because he chose to come down in human form and live amongst us.
Yes.
So why couldn't his character change then as a result of?
Well, I wouldn't say you'd say his character changed. You probably would say our understanding changed because really the unchangeability of God is also something that sort of has a stronger emphasis in Pauline writing. And it's present in Proverbs and that never ending, unfathomable. But God is a jealous God. God's a vengeful God. God, the God of the Old Testament, as much as there's an infinite nature of who God is, the way that God intersects with humanity and the way that God interacts now with humanity are two different. I mean, it's just a whole different system. We have the Holy Spirit. They didn't have any. So we can't blame Peter and Judas. I mean, like, they didn't have God's Spirit. In fact, Judas was, as John suggests, driven by Satan or satanic forces in order to do what he did.
He actually thinks sometimes he might have been.
He was picked by God from the very beginning for that purpose.
And maybe, I don't know. I feel sorry for Judas.
Yeah.
Because how could he be the one to betray Christ? And, and there's a great book, and I think it was.
But he didn't mean to.
Where the last temptation. Did you read it?
No, I saw the movie. Just kidding.
The movie? No, just kidding. But in there,
I did the movie actually when I was in high school.
in the book, they and Judas conspired.
Yeah, I mean, there's some heretical stuff. He also said Jesus had a child with Mary Magdalene. So,
Yeah.
which there's all sorts of problems, but yeah. So, all right, that's it. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Oh, that was good. Covered Gnosticism there.
Yeah, I know.